Oh, Catherine. I love that, Catherine, reading 28 minutes a day in February. I feel that, Anna. That's great. I'm gonna let folks continue to share these practices in the chat. It's lovely to hear the things you're all leaning into as we enter this new year, and we're going to get started while you're doing that. So just to give you the lay of the land on what we're doing today, for those of you who were in the first session, which we held in December, it's not necessary that you were there, but for those of you who were, we started exploring the Three Horizons framework, and today we're going to deepen that with a guest, Cassie Robinson, who's joining us from the UK. So we're gonna let Cassie share with us her hypothesis for grant making practices into the third horizon. We're gonna have some time in breakout rooms to really dig into the topics that you care most about, and then we'll come back. And at the end of all of these webinars, we stay on the line for an additional 15 minutes. So the Ripple Foundation will be there, GIH will be there, and Cassie will stay as well. So if you have questions or there is more discussion you want to dig into, we'll stay on the line for that time, and we invite you to do the same. I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Maggie to talk us through some of the infrastructure of Zoom today.
The evidence that I really talk a lot with my hands. I love this slide. I have, as the host, I've enabled a live transcript. So if anyone would like to have that capability today, all you have to do is kind of go down to the bottom of your ribbon and click on there where it says live transcript. You'll see the CC icon for closed captions, and there you can enable subtitles. You can also view a full transcript at any time. And if you click on subtitle settings, you can adjust the font of the closed captions if you'd like as well. If you have any questions about that or any technical difficulties at any time, just send me a private chat message, and your chat button is kind of in the middle of that bottom ribbon, and you can select me as a participant and send me a message.
Thanks, Maggie. And Kate, can you walk us through what we're doing today?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Trainer with Grantmakers in Health. During today's webinar, we're going to consider how philanthropic practices are evolving in order to bring about a more just and equitable future. And we'll hear how changes in practice allow funders to effectively steward resources and make meaningful change. Our objectives for this session are, first, to give you a better understanding of the Three Horizons framework, which Katie mentioned earlier, as a way of thinking about the future. Second, we'll gain a deeper understanding of practice changes that can help philanthropy build a more equitable future. And finally, to grow the network of philanthropic leaders who are equipped to work equitably and to offer an opportunity for peer exchange and learning. Next slide, please. The Ripple Foundation and Grantmakers in Health are committed to preparing philanthropy for the future. For those of you unfamiliar with GIH, we are a national nonprofit educational organization dedicated to helping foundations and corporate giving programs improve the health of all people. We work with philanthropic organizations through education, networking, and leadership. Ripple is a nonprofit operating foundation dedicated to fostering equitable, exceptional health and well-being for all. Ripple partners with foundations, healthcare organizations, government institutions, and other change agents to guide and inspire innovative system transformation. And they have two signature initiatives, Foresight and Rethink Health. Katie, I'll turn things back over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. So for those of you who were with us in December, you'll know we started this series by beginning to explore the Three Horizons framework as a container for thinking about innovative philanthropy practices and how those might change as we try to build a more equitable future. And in that session, you all actually began to think about how your own practices and those you were seeing in the field mapped onto the 3 horizons. So today we're going to dig more deeply into that framework. And to start, I'm going to give a quick refresher on what this framework is for those of you who haven't seen it before, and for those of you who might need a reminder before handing it over to our speaker, Cassie Robinson. So we begin here with the first horizon. The first horizon is meant to represent business as usual, or the world as we know it. You can see it as the dominant practice in the moment that we're in now. So typically we can already see in this moment how the practices of the first horizon are really no longer fit for purpose and aren't really serving us anymore. We have this sense that they need to change. The third horizon, all the way on the right, is the future that we dream of, or the world that we want to build and grow together. Importantly, this future is already with us. So if you look at the current moment right on the left-hand side, you can see that all 3 horizons are present in any given moment, even though the third horizon is smaller than business as usual. So the seeds of the future that we want to build are already with us, and part of our task is recognizing those and seeing where they're showing up. And the second horizon in the middle bridges these. It's the arena of experimentation and disruption. The innovations and practices that we adopt in the second horizon can lead us into the transformative future that we want to build, or they can be co-opted by this very strong pull of business as usual. So part of our challenge in the second horizon is thinking about those practices that are really going to bridge us into the future that we want to be part of. So last time we mapped some of our own practices and those we see onto the 3 horizons. And today we're going to hear from Cassie Robinson about her experiences thinking about the future of grant making and her hypothesis for what the first, second, and third horizons of philanthropy look like. So Cassie currently works with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Earth%, Partners for a New Economy, Power to Change, and Guy's and St. Thomas's foundations. That's a lot of work on for one person. She brings to our conversation today deep experience in funding strategy and innovation, and in field building and philanthropy. She's also the co-lead of Philia's Imagination, Foresight, and Regenerative Futures Community of Practice, and is on the steering committee for Onward Social Fabric Program, the advisory group for the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, and the strategy group of the Funders Collaborative Hub. And we are so grateful that Cassie has taken the time today to share with us some of her own experiences in philanthropy and how they have evolved her thinking about the future of philanthropic practice and where we're headed. So Cassie, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Great, thank you. And yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm calling in from London, where my ceiling makes me look really tall, but I'm actually up on a mezzanine level. So just in case you're wondering. So yeah, you've already done a sort of good job of summarizing what I'm doing now, but I can just touch on it a little bit more. So I'm sort of doing, I've just come out of a full-time role, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But at the moment, I guess I'm in a bit of a transition period myself. And so I've picked up some different pieces of work whilst I figure out what I want to do longer term. So these are all different kind of funding organizations and foundations I'm working with. Some of which is focused very much on collective imagination, which is a big theme of my work at the moment, where there's a real drive to start using more deliberative democracy processes like citizen assemblies, which have a role. Some of the work I'm doing is also saying we need to start further upstream in the soil, and that's why our collective imagination is really important, because we need kind of bolder and more imaginative leaps at the moment. I'm also doing some work around the power of music and culture in service of the planet, which is the work at Earth%, looking at how we can build the field of community tech so that it is a viable alternative to the power of big tech. And as Katie said, a lot of my work is also around kind of futures and foresight, building that capacity in foundations, but also in kind of wider civil society. So yeah, that's just a little bit about what I'm doing. And then if you don't mind switching to the next slide, this is how someone described how I'm working at the moment, which I just really like. So working in the entanglement of what is and what might be. And that is often how I feel. Maybe that's having one foot in the second horizon and one foot in the third. Although sometimes I feel I've also got one in the first horizon too. So over to the next slide, please. And yeah, so I guess I was sort of asked to tell a bit of a story as to how I got to this hypothesis, and hypothesis even sounds a bit grand, but what we're going to sort of reflect on a bit later. But I started my work as a funder. I'm really very new to funding in a way. I started working as a funder 3 years ago at the National Lottery Community Fund, which is the largest funder of community activity in the UK. So they distribute £600 million a year. And in my role as a Deputy Director of Funding Strategy, I looked after a portfolio of £60 million a year and a variety of different funding programmes. But it's also very linked to government. So it's really a public sector body more than a philanthropic funder. And that comes with trade-offs. So on the one hand, amazing level of funding to distribute, but I guess also working in a public sector bureaucracy that is very accountable, not only to the public, which I think is a great thing, but also to government. So, different challenges and opportunities, but particularly with that size of organization. So it's 850 people, and many people there having to really operate in the first horizon. They are that their role is to bring stability, reassurance, and that was quite difficult to shift. I won't go into that in too much detail, but I had 3 different roles there, and yeah, it was quite a struggle to shift people into being able to identify and pay attention to that kind of third horizon. And that was also a challenge because as a funder, the National Lottery Community Fund was mostly a responsive funder. So the portfolio I ran was much more strategic and more experimental. But a vast majority of the funding programs were very responsive. So they also kind of relied on whatever came in, 1,000 flowers bloom. And actually this idea that, we just fund what communities say they want to do because communities know best. And, I think that things in the world can be a bit more complex than that. So yeah, I realized I had quite a lot of work to do on just shifting out of this very responsive, reactive grant making into also thinking about, how do we actually fund in a way that's going to create different futures. And this slide is just, I actually have archived all of the work I've done there, so I'll share a link in case that's useful. But a couple of things that we did that I suppose linked to this conversation was I set up a scanning and sensing network across the fund. So for 18 months, we invited people from across the fund to come and kind of share what they saw on the horizon, and pay more attention to the horizon. And we tried to map what people were sensing using the 3 horizons framework. So that was just something I tried to do in terms of building capacity internally to do that kind of sensing. We also set up a funding program that was quite experimental last summer called the Emerging Futures Fund. And again, that was saying, how do we actually resource communities to have that time and space to think and imagine different futures? So that was another thing that we tried out. Over to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk really quickly through a couple of other so this is obviously about the 3 horizons, which is the one I'll finish on. But I did have to keep trying different ways in to like change when I was trying to set up new funding programs or get people on board with some of what I was trying to do. So I'm just going to share a couple of the other frameworks that I used in order to do that. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It's actually been adapted from the Berkana 2 loops model, which is the Tamarack Institute in the US. And I've been using this since about 2010 and just love it as a way of kind of understanding what position you're trying to take when you're doing change work. And it's really about this idea of a dying system and an emerging system. And, you know, are you going to support the transition from existing to next? Are you going to support the stabilizing of the dying system? Are you going to put your funding into building the new and connecting those pioneers? Are you actually going to invest in helping things to die? You know, the new can't emerge if things aren't made way for it, if we don't make way for it. So this was just one of the frameworks that I brought into the National Tree Community Fund to sort of say, you know, where do we want our funding to be being used? The next slide is something that has been created as part of a systems innovation paper. So this is an organization called Alt Now in partnership with the Rockwool Foundation in Denmark. And this is, I mean, it's a very simple diagram, but again, there's many people in the UK philanthropy world that talk about systems change, and we're changing the system, we're doing systems change. But I felt like, and, you know, just to say, I don't know how to do systems change either. Yeah, we could spend hours just talking about what that even means. But I felt like a lot of practice, and especially at the National Tree Community Fund, it was actually much more about making change in the current system. So I just found this diagram, as simple as it is, very helpful in explaining, like, we're not looking to do in the funding that we're trying to do that is about this 3rd horizon. We really need to make sure it's not just, you know, reorganizing the existing system. And I think that's particularly hard to make a distinction between those two. The next slide. This was another framework. One of the things that I established there last year is a 10-year funding program. So giving grants that are for 10 years. I don't think that that's continued now I've left, but we did manage to do some 10-year grants. And again, because the nature of the National Tree Community Fund means that they mostly were funding at that niche level, like local projects, local community initiatives. And I guess I was trying to, again, a different way in through another framework. This has been adapted by Tatiana Fraser and Giels. This idea that if we only just fund community initiatives, but we're not actually looking at the laws, the regulation, the sort of cultural myth and narrative work and the healing work in the soil, then why would we just keep funding community initiatives? Again, that felt like, you know, you're just kind of plaster sticking. So this was another, just another way in to trying to kind of shift into a different type of funding practice. Next slide, please. And then, the 3 horizons, which I won't go into, but that became particularly useful around this idea of the scanning and sensing network that I mentioned earlier. So if we got our funding officers and grant officers and portfolio managers to start to notice and pay attention to what they were seeing on the horizon and plotting it against these, that was another way I was trying to shift our grant making. And so whilst this was all going on, you know, internally, I'm trying to really bring some quite different and new practice. I mean, I'm not saying it's new everywhere, but just where the organization I was working in, it was very new. I think there's lots of other people trying to do this in different ways and in different contexts. But as I was doing that internally, I was looking for community and solidarity elsewhere as well. It can be quite lonely work trying to do things differently in a very big organization. And I joined other like funding networks, and I guess I was always looking for my tribe, if you like, in the funding world. Like that's what I was looking for, because I was new to funding. And actually it was in those conversations, alongside my experience of working inside the fund, that I just had this growing sense of these binaries developing, and maybe not developing. I think they've been there for a little while, and actually in some ways they've probably been accelerated or deepened since the Black Lives Matter uprising during the first wave of the pandemic, and just all of the critique of philanthropy, which is very important. But that kind of, I think some of the positions have become even more binary. So what I was noticing, and again, this is just my experience, and I don't want to suggest this is necessarily what it's like everywhere at all, but I felt like there was this sort of camp of people working in funding who, you know, really were technocrats, and they, you know, in some ways maybe were quite traditional or in that first horizon, and some of that is, you know, you need some of that, and very much like looking at evidence-based everything, impact, linearity, lots of data, lots of talk of reform and continuous improvement and that kind of work. And then I felt like the reaction to that was the other camp was people talking about, you know, shifting power, everything is about participatory grant making, measurement and talk of impact is, you know, is like an old way of doing things. Everything has to be relational. And I felt like, yeah, there was just these two camps, and I didn't really feel, I felt like there's value in both of them, but it wasn't that, like, that wasn't gonna, that I couldn't sit in either of them. So the next slide, please. So I guess I started to think, well, you know, what is a third space and what's beyond these binaries? And, you know, I wanted to think, how could I start to talk about that in a way that brought more criticality or complexity to the idea that it's not one or the other. And the next slide, please. And yeah, I guess these were the, you know, I felt like in that third space, like, where are the people that are dreaming and imagining and experimenting? And I thought that there were some different questions that we needed to be asking than the ones that those two camps were asking. And then the next slide, please. Can I just check as well how I'm doing for time? Because I just want to give me a few.
You have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay.
You're doing great.
Okay. So yeah, so that led me to sort of starting to map out this idea of, if you took the two binaries, so like the first horizon and the second horizon. So I thought about the 3 horizons model, and I thought, you know, if you started to map grant making practices that I felt were coming out of those two different camps into the first and second horizons, what would be in that third space, that third horizon? And this was, you know, it wasn't just me. I had like a couple of other people like were helping me think about it. We were doing it in a holiday cottage in Suffolk over a glass of wine, and it, you know, it definitely wasn't like a fixed thing. And I just shared it as a blog post on a Google Doc, so people could add comments and thoughts. And obviously you can't read that, and they've just put the link in the blog in the chat to the blog. And I'm not going to go through it all now, but there's like 5 that I'm just going to pull out and give an example of. And then I think that's what you're going to sort of go into discussion around. So the next slide. Yeah, so I have got some notes. The first one was, you know, this idea of, you know, not just funding projects which might be like first horizon. And I'm sure for many of you, you're like way ahead of this and you're all in the third horizon already. And of course, what's really lovely about the 3 horizons model is, in theory, like there is no better or worse. Actually, sometimes a project might be just the thing to fund. But, you know, we talked about projects in the first horizon. In the second horizon, it might be more like a thematic area of work, or a thematic area or an area of work. But in the third horizon, you know, what about funding more systemic shifts or creating conditions or resourcing infrastructure? So this is just an example of a collaboration of funders and initiatives that were resourcing over time this idea of imagination infrastructure, which is really about funding the conditions in which communities can come together to try and create an alternative set of futures. The next slide, please. The next one that we sort of pulled out from the table was about working with complexity. So I think, you know, the first horizon was more about linear, you know, just working through a lens of linearity. The second horizon, I think you hear a lot about multiple perspectives. Certainly in the UK systems change community, if you're bringing in multiple perspectives, you're doing systems change. And I am being a little bit ironic there, or sarcastic. But yeah, actually, there's something very different about working with complexity rather than just multiple perspectives. So the third horizon, this idea of working with complexity, and this is a piece of work actually happening in Australia, which is very much linked to transition design. But the complexity is that they're working on healing. They're doing healing work because there's a lot of just transition happening from old industry to new economy. They're also doing like structural work. So that kind of 4 layers of soil, communities, infrastructure, law and regulation, that I think that's a really good example of like working with complexity. The next slide, please. This is about the first horizon was about holding on to power or just being unaware of power. The second horizon, there's a huge community in the UK that talks about wanting to shift power. And then the third horizon I'm suggesting is more about taking responsibility for power and positionality, like using your positionality wisely and with accountability and kind of respect and all of those things, but actually, yeah, being responsible with your, like, for your power and using it. And this is just a foundation in the UK that has been really willing to step forward to say, actually, there are some outcomes we want to achieve around the natural environment and climate, and we have created a set of missions or outcomes, and actually we want to use our position and our power to build unusual partnerships, bring in the government, and all of the funding they're doing is kind of, they are being directive. And that might sound really obvious, but maybe that's really common in your context. But in the UK and in the community funding communities I was in, I felt like a lot of funders were stepping back actually, and it's like they, yeah. So that's trying to explain that one a bit more. The next slide, please, which was about, so the sort of, this is about finding and acknowledging gaps in data. So yeah, actually in the first horizon, you might not even be using data, or you're probably using data by looking backwards at what has been. I can't remember what the second horizon one is for this one, but it'll come to me, or maybe someone can put it in the chat. But this is a project that's called The Good Ancestor, which is trying to bring almost the idea of data from future generations into grant making practice. So they've sort of developed a whole set of tools around ancestral grant making as a practice. What isn't in the data if we only look at what is today. And then the last one, which is, maybe go to the next slide, because the two slides are about the same thing. This one is about like prioritizing not just lived experience and not just learned experience. So in the first horizon, you could say people probably prioritize learned experience. In the second horizon, people are prioritizing lived experience. At the National Lottery Community Fund, we ran a whole grant program called Leaders with Lived Experience, and it was amazing. I think the skill that we really need in grant making is how you bring together lived, learned, and practice experience. So this is an example of some work that was happening to bring together lived, learned, and practice experience, actually also with like collective intelligence. So using data, so like machine and human experience in grant making. Anyway, so that I was just trying to sort of bring a few to life. And I'm going to hand back over now to the.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had really interesting conversations in your rooms. I'm sure the time was not long enough. As Anna said, it never is, for diving into these conversations. We're going to do just a really quick debrief so you have the opportunity to hear a little bit of what happened in each room. We're asking facilitators just to name one compelling topic that came up in the room. And I will start for the room that was thinking about funding systemic shifts rather than funding projects. And one of the things that had really caught people's attention in Cassie's overview was this idea of infrastructuring imagination, or thinking about how you give folks a space for the kind of creativity that it takes for innovative ideas and what that requires of us. So longer grants, more flexibility, less power and control held in the grant maker, and more space for folks to really think creatively and expansively. So that's one takeaway from our room. Anna, can I pass it to you?
Sure, yeah. We had the complexity, we were the complexity group. And I think for us, we saw a lot of the first horizon view around operating from linearity, right? And really just institutions and organizations stuck in that mindset and finding it difficult to shift out of that. But a lot of, I think, work headed in the direction of the second horizon, right? Around understanding the need to bring in multiple voices, the need to develop trust with the communities and have their voices be heard, as well as the really understanding of the many different levels and forces that are impacting the work, right? So it's not just one thing, it's in which adds to the complexity, as well as the political environment. So, realizing that complexity is the way, and but we didn't get too much into what does it mean then to be in this third horizon around working with complexity, and how do we get there? And so I think a lot more conversation needed there.
That's awesome. Thanks, Anna. Sierra, can I ask you to report from your room?
Absolutely. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. And so I had the finding and acknowledging gaps in data group. And so I think a lot of what we talked about was just really kind of similar to Anna, involving the community. So involving the community and finding and acknowledging these gaps in data that exist, and just making sure to build trust around data, letting go of ownership and creating a shared data structure that also engages the community with the design and interpretation of that data.
It's really interesting. Thanks, Sierra. Maggie.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, our breakout group discussed the incorporating of learned, lived, and practice experience. And a couple of points that we were really mulling over for a large portion of our time together was, who is currently, and who will be considered experts, across the different horizons, because that having a better grasp on that will really help inform how to incorporate all of the different experiences. And we realized something that Cassie had said earlier in her presentation was something around, incorporating AI with, and, I think for a lot of us that gave rise to sort of some like thorny reaction. And that's something that in sort of the third category, we kind of chalked it up to something that might be something that would be required of us to let go of, though we don't really have the answers right now. And like Anna was saying, we didn't totally have enough time to get into what we thought the third horizon would look like.
That's really interesting, Maggie. AI always gives us a little bit of pause. Becky, can you finish us out?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be quick. We had a great discussion, and it really, the theme was, we were the Sharing Power group, sorry. The theme was really to kind of turn all of our, what I would consider standard practices on their head. Everything from, should we even have an application process because there is inherent power in having to apply, to how we structure our evaluations, the data we use, and really thinking about how that is the implications of inviting community members in to truly inform those practices, how hard it is, first of all, and how different it looks when they tell us, no, those measures of impact don't hold meaning for us. What would hold meaning for us is this other thing. But we really finished on a note that having more spaces like this among peers to safely share and talk through this is really needed and would be supportive.
That's great. Thank you, Becky, and leads me nicely into some of the things I want to say to close us out. So one of the things that came up in my breakout room was this idea that you cannot in an instant change your grant making practices and enter the third horizon, that these things happen gradually. And sometimes what that transition looks like is grant making practices that fall in all three horizons. So we want to leave you with just a couple of ideas as you continue to mull on this conversation, inviting you just to notice the places where you are living into the third horizon and how your current practices are mapping onto the three horizons. And then thinking just about small places that you could try to do something different, places where you could push your practice or conduct a small experiment that would help you learn kind of what happens when we do this. What can we take from this small experience or experiment and move our practice forward? We do have 2 remaining sessions in this series, one in March and one in April, both of which will spotlight practitioners in the field who are thinking about innovative practices in philanthropy. The one in March on working in complexity, which I hear there's an appetite for more conversation about, and then thinking about race and power in April. Watch your inbox for dates on those, and this is how you can get connected with Ripple and with Grantmakers in Health, and Cassie's information is here as well in case you want to follow along with what she is doing. My colleague Maggie's going to launch just a quick poll. We hope you will take just to tell us what you thought of today and help us create content that is useful and conversations that are valuable to the group. But I just want to thank you all for being here today and for engaging in this conversation, and particular thanks to Cassie for inspiring and provoking deep thoughts about our grant making and philanthropic practices. But thank you all for being here, and we will stay on the line for another 15 minutes to continue to have conversation on this topic, ask questions. We invite you to stay with us. Thanks, Monica. Hi, folks. If you've stayed on the line to continue the conversation, we invite your questions or thoughts or reflections, things that are on your mind as we're leaving this conversation.
Oh, Patricia, I think you're on mute still.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, is there a link to the diagram on the 3 horizons? I missed that part of the presentation. I came in a little bit late.
Yeah, absolutely. We, Patricia, will send all the materials from this, but we can particularly send you, we have a little slide deck and a video on the 3 horizons that might be valuable. Okay. And do you have the link to Cassie's hypothesis about grant making across the 3 horizons? That we can, I think, easily pop in the chat for you now.
Right. I think I've downloaded, well, let me see. It was a link in the chat, which I downloaded.
Okay.
But I missed the first presentation on the 3 horizons. I wanted to look at that a little bit more deeply.
Sure. Yeah, so we'll share what we have on the 3 horizons, including the December webinar that we did that dove into that a little more deeply.
I must have missed that one. Did I miss the December webinar?
No, you were on it. You were there. I remember.
You were there.
I remember well.
I must not have paid. I must not have. And you presented on the 3 horizons?
Richard Blum had done a little overview, but it might not have sunk in.
Yeah, I don't think I paid a lot of attention to, but I did pay attention to it today.
December is hard to absorb new information.
That's right. That was so 21. That was